Uh, because we have to start with a good laugh for a show that is going to have a number of good laughs, let's start with Dr. Theresa Tam. This is out of Canada, and it's recent. Okay. Yes, that is Canada's chief medical officer wearing a mask because it's 2023 and the studies have not yet been definitive enough. Okay.
With today's authorization, NACI is reaffirming its guidance on the use of COVID-19 vaccines this fall. NACI recommends authorized age groups get an updated COVID-19 vaccine dose this fall.
You're not having an audible hallucination. She's not saying Nazi. She's saying Nazi. Because in Canada, they had the great idea of when they're going to experiment on human beings to do it through the National Auto... Oh, geez, what was it, Nazi? The National... Oh, geez. It's NACI. National... I'll get it in a second. She's not saying Nazi. She's saying Nazi, but it might come to the same.
6 months after the last vaccine dose or infection. We will have enough supply of the updated COVID-19 vaccines to support immunization programs across Canada.
Updated, just like 2.0, Vaccines 2.0. It's the National Advisory Committee on Immunization. Nazi. No, sorry, it's Nazi. Okay.
The Omicron variant continues to evolve, with XBB subvariants such as EG.5 continuing to circulate in Canada and globally.
Can't do it. That's all. That's all we're getting. And whenever I hear them talk about a variant that ends in a 0.5, I see Jimmy Fallon, 0.5. All right, speaking of unfunny comedians, we have a funny comedian on tonight. Not just funny, insightful, intelligent, wildly more informed than I would dare say 98% of politicians out there. Dave Smith comedy. If you don't, everybody knows who he is. I'm sort of excited, geeking out a little bit that Dave Smith. I see him right now in backstage. Barnes is there with a shirt that says hush hush, and he's got a cigar in his mouth. It's going to be an amazing show. I am drinking whiskey out of the Wanted for President mugs that we have sent. It's amazing, and I'm drinking Freedom whiskey because we're going to talk freedom tonight, or the lack thereof. All right, Dave Smith is in the crowd. I think I must be forgetting something. Let me just make sure that we're live everywhere. We are live on Rumble. We're live on Locals. Bringing in the guest. I'm going to bring in the guest. Okay, Dave, bringing you in. 3, 2, 1. Robert, sir, bringing you in. And I want to put myself on the bottom so that when I put a comment over my face, it will only block me. Gentlemen, how goes your respective battles?
It's going good, man. What's up, everybody? Thanks for having me here. This is long overdue. I know a lot of people are excited for us to all do this.
Well, I mean, we're going to tackle the madness of the world. I mean, I think everybody watching knows very well who you are, but Dave, just in case they are new to the internet, who are you before we get into childhood? Because we're getting into childhood.
Oh no! All right. I'm Dave. I'm a stand-up comedian and a podcaster, and yeah, that's me.
I'm going to get into this. Born and raised, you're born and raised in New York, right?
Yes, sir.
I know from some podcasts. Did you have an interesting childhood growing up?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if I had an interesting childhood. I think I had a somewhat typical childhood for someone who was like born in the 80s in Brooklyn. Like that was kind of what we all did. By today's standards, I think, yes, it's pretty interesting.
What did your parents do?
My mother is a psychologist, and my father, we were never quite sure what he did. He was a strange fellow.
Your dad was around growing up, or were your parents divorced?
Yeah, they got divorced when I was like 3 years old. And my dad was, I wouldn't describe him as around. That's not the term I would use.
Which part of Brooklyn did you grow up in?
I grew up in Park Slope and then Prospect Heights. So like that area.
What was that like in the 80s?
Well, okay, I lived in a lot of different places. Like we moved a lot. So I lived in I lived with My parents, when I was first born, we lived in like Brooklyn Heights, and then we lived on 8th Avenue in Brooklyn, and then I moved to 5th Street, and then to 12th Street, and then to 11th Street, and then to 5th Street, and then to Sterling Place, and I think I'm missing one in there. Besides, I moved like 8 or 9 different times, but it was always like very close within that neighborhood. So we kind of moved around that area. So I don't, I grew up all around. So anyway, what was it like? It kind of depended on what block you were on, like how it was. Brooklyn was a more like, it's not what you think of Brooklyn today. If you think of like hipster Brooklyn or something like that, it wasn't like that at all. It was more like, block parties and opening fire hydrants on hot days, and like all the kids like running around. There was a lot of just like being outside with kids, where the adults would just like kind of kick you out of the house, and you just went out and dealt with like the other kids. So it was I think it was cool. I liked how my childhood in Brooklyn, but I think it was a very different world than what my kids are growing up in. Let
me ask you this: when you moved around that much, I got to ask you why. Is that a New York thing to get a good apartment or to move to another apartment, or is it for jobs? Like why would anyone move that many times in their life?
I mean, I think it was things like we moved when my parents got divorced, and then we moved to so we moved into another place, and then we moved to okay, there's a slightly better apartment, and then my mother was like dating a guy who lived on that block, and then they broke up, so we moved again, and then they got back together, so then we moved again into a place with them together, and then they got married, and so then we moved into we actually had like a house where they were together, and it was like things like that, it wasn't like jobs changing. It was just like who my mom was dating.
Let me ask you this, and this might be my own biases or life experience. Your mom's a psychologist.
Mm-hmm.
Is she crazy, or is she not? Is she a sane psychologist?
No, she's sane. I mean, she was a little crazy back then. She got a lot saner as she grew older. My mom was young when she had us. So this was like her in her 20s, So it was, I didn't have kids till I was like in my 30s, and there's a big difference, I think. So she was a little bit crazy in those days. But she's my mother's like totally brilliant. Like incredibly smart, and a really great mom. Was always a really great mother to me. So part of it was being like young and being kind of, in some wild situations. But then she's a great psychologist. I think genuinely great. But things were a little wild back in the day.
My experience with psychiatrists, and especially psychiatrists, they tend to be the craziest of people on.
There's something to that for sure. Yeah.
You said us, so siblings?
Yeah, I have an older sister, and then I have a younger brother who was he's technically my half brother, but he's a brother to me. But he's my baby brother. He was 13 years younger than me. So all those days I'm talking about was me and my sister.
Now, it sounds like the way you're describing New York was Brooklyn a little bit more working middle class than it is to that part of Brooklyn is today. Like these days, it's gentrified.
Oh yeah. No, it was all. I mean, I don't even know. Like working class might have been too kind of a term. Like there was a lot of people there who I think weren't working at all. Brooklyn back then was much more like it was much more rough for sure, and it was not. It wasn't even upper middle class. I don't think I knew anyone upper middle class until I was like a little bit older. But back then it was very much like a very working class environment. A very fist fights were just happening like on the streets, and you were and if you went back to your parents and were like, "Hey, this guy, this guy just punched me in the mouth," their attitude would be like, "Well, what'd you do?" Like, like, and so it was that type of environment.
Okay, let me ask the question. It's been driving me crazy, and I couldn't find an answer online. Smith is your last name, your real last name?
Yes.
That's your dad's last name?
That is my father's last name. Yes.
And I'm Canadian, so the wife doesn't take the husband's last name. Did your mom take your dad's last name?
Maybe when they were married, maybe she did for a little bit, but then she went back to her maiden name after they got divorced.
Now, to what degree, like you talked about how different it is culturally for kids. In other words, back then you grew up on the streets as much as you grew up in the homes. And now, the whole safe space culture arguably started with the whole kidnapping scares of in the mid-late 90s. Sort of, now kids have to go out on play dates. It's got to be organized. In West Virginia, there was a case where they went after a mother because she let her kid play out in the streets. That was negligence. How much do you think that influenced your perspective today? And otherwise, what would you ascribe the sort of independence of thought? I'm always curious why some people have independence of thought and some people just don't. Some people question authority. Some people always assume authority is true. What do you attribute your upbringing in part to that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I don't know. I mean, like I've read about like what you're talking about, like those kidnapping scares and how it changed kind of like the culture into like the helicopter parent culture. And if I'm being completely honest, I mean, I got 2 little kids, and I'm kind of a helicopter parent. Like I'm not just like letting them out on the streets. And I think a lot of the way I grew up, I couldn't imagine raising my kids that way. Like that's just not happening. I'm not just like sending my kids out to just go rumble on the streets. That's never going to happen. I don't know, man. I don't know what to attribute it to. I know all of this happened with me and I am where I am now. So I don't know if it's like genetics or it was my experiences. I do know that it definitely shaped me a lot, that, dealing with that environment, dealing with like just being told like, oh no, you're like, you got to leave the house, and then there being scary elements outside of the house, and then just having to figure that out in this kind of Lord of the Flies situation with other kids. I don't know though. There was always something. I feel like there was always something in me as far back as I can remember, where I was always kind of I always kind of had an attitude of like questioning authority. Like if teachers or whoever had a rule, always being like, no, I think that rule's bullshit. I don't believe that. Like, I remember that from like a very young age. And so I don't know whether it was whether it was nurture or nature, or I don't know exactly what instilled that in me, but definitely all of that happened.
Now, Dave, what I'm going to do, I'm going to end this on YouTube. It's not going to change anything on our end. We're just going to go exclusive to Rumble. Everyone has a link. Head on over there because we're leaving YouTube in